History records English monarchs who were so consumed by their male lovers that they never married or produced heirs. They wore crowns, held supreme power in their hands, but their personal lives hid secrets that defied the harsh norms of their era. In total, 6 kings and 1 queen are believed to have belonged to the LGBTQ+ community. They challenged religious constraints and brutal discrimination, and many paid a heavy price for who they truly were. Ultimately, despite being monarchs, they were still human beings, with desires and loves. William was the eldest son of the great William the Conqueror, who brought Norman rule to England in 1066. As the oldest living son, William Rufus, also known as the Red, inherited his father's greatest kingdom, England. However, William was unpopular with the people. He levied heavy taxes and lacked his father's fearsome might. And one thing made him especially controversial in the deeply religious Middle Ages. He was homosexual, a great sin at the time. Some said he was addicted to every vice, especially lechery, and most of all, sodomy. William's court was filled with attractive young men who wore fashionable clothes with pointed shoes and long hair. William was so busy with his male lovers that he did not marry or produce an heir. This made him the only obstacle between his power-hungry brothers and the throne. Fate struck during a hunting trip with his brother Henry. William was shot by an arrow and died. Although nothing is certain, the hypothesis of fratricide, brother killing brother, is considered very likely. William's body was left in the forest until a group of peasants brought it back to Winchester in a cart. Notably, the king's body was denied a Christian burial, a sign of his disapproval even after death. When Henry ascended to the throne, he removed many of William's favourites and forced the remaining ones to cut their hair, as an act of erasing the traces of the old court. Richard, known by the nickname the Lionheart, was a handsome warrior, and at 1.95 m he stood out significantly from his contemporaries. He was a chivalrous romantic, seeing himself as a hero in a fairy tale. He spent most of his childhood in the Duchy of Aquitaine, France, with his mother Eleanor, who was estranged from his father, Henry II of England. At the age of 22, Richard and his brothers rebelled against their father. To strengthen his position, Richard allied with the teenage French king, Philip II. A contemporary chronicler named Roger Holden recorded that Richard and Philip ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds were not far apart, and the King of France loved him as his own soul. And they loved each other so much that the King of England was utterly astonished at the ardent love between them and marvelled at it. Historians still debate whether this is evidence of Richard's homosexuality or merely common courtly language at the time. When Richard's father died, he became king at the age of 32. He wasn't interested in the hard work of ruling, leaving everything to his mother and setting off on a crusade to try and take the holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. There is evidence that Richard had affairs with women during the campaign and acknowledged an illegitimate son. However, he spent very little time with his queen, Berengaria of Navarre, and had no children with her. Richard's crusade was unsuccessful. On his way home, he was careless, poorly disguised, and captured by the Duke of Austria. He was ransomed for £100,000, equivalent to about 8 years of the English government's tax revenue. Richard's carelessness nearly bankrupted England. Upon returning to England, he discovered the country was at war with his former lover, Philip of France. During a siege in France, Richard, who apparently thought himself invincible, walked along the battlements without armour when he was struck by an arrow. The wound became gangrenous and the king died in his mother's arms. He was king for 9 years, but spent only 6 months in the kingdom. Edward II. Edward II was the son of the famous warrior king Edward Longshanks. However, this son had no interest in war, which deeply disappointed his father. Edward the father tried to change his son's character by taking him on campaigns and giving him a courtier skilled in tournaments, Piers Gaveston. But this backfired spectacularly when Edward and Gaveston fell in love. Longshanks exiled Gaveston, but when the king died, the new 23-year-old King Edward invited his lover back. Gaveston flaunted his influence over the king, even wearing royal purple robes and the queen's wedding jewels at the coronation. This infuriated the nobles. A group of nobles, led by the Earl of Lancaster, hunted down, stabbed, and beheaded Gaveston. Edward was heartbroken. This incident ignited years of armed conflict between Edward's supporters and the Lancaster faction. Edward also suffered a heavy defeat against the new King of Scotland. Additionally, climate change caused a year of terrible famine. The clergy blamed the country's decline on the king's immorality. Edward then allied with the powerful Despencer family. It was rumoured that Hugh Despencer the Younger was the king's new lover. Lancaster's forces captured Despencer, hanged, drew and quartered him, and cut off, burned his genitals as punishment for sodomy and heresy. Edward II's control of the throne completely collapsed. His queen, Isabella of France, nicknamed the She-Wolf, rallied an army with her lover. They invaded England, imprisoned Edward, and ordered his assassination. Edward was killed by being skewered through the anus with a red-hot iron poker. A tragic and horrifying end for a king who was believed to have defied social prejudice. Richard II. Richard inherited the throne at a very young age, just 10 years old. His father had died earlier, so when his grandfather Edward III passed away, Richard became king. The real power behind the throne was Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt. After the plague, 1/3 of England's population had died. The surviving peasants found the demand for labour much higher than the number of people available to do it. They left the feudal lands where their families had been tied for centuries to seek better wages, and many succeeded, becoming wealthier than ever before. This angered the nobles, who saw themselves as superior and imposed restrictive laws on everything from where peasants could live to the type of clothes they could wear. The government issued a tax on every citizen, but due to miscalculating the population, they didn't collect as much as expected, so they taxed again. This sparked the peasants' revolt, demanding an end to the nobility except for the king. John of Gaunt had to flee. When the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, finally met the king, he was killed by the mayor of London. The rebels drew their bows and arrows, and the 14-year-old King Richard rode forward to calm them. He gave a speech demanding their obedience and promising to treat them fairly. Amazingly, they believed him and dispersed. But they should not have trusted the king. After this meeting, the rebel leaders were hunted down and executed. Now, Richard was hated by the people. He also made the nobles hate him by withdrawing from the war with France, a war that had brought them wealth. Richard tried to restore his reputation and was the first English king to have his portrait painted. But there was one thing about the king that medieval people could never forgive. Richard was homosexual, and like the kings before him, this caused homophobic outrage among the nobility. Contemporaries wrote about his handsome features, effeminate manner and lisp. He made his lover, Robert de Vere, Duke of Ireland. This caused great outrage because usually only members of the royal family were made dukes, not ordinary nobles. De Vere led Richard's army into battle against court enemies but fled the battlefield, leaving the army leaderless and forced to surrender. De Vere was stripped of his titles and condemned to death by Parliament, but he escaped to the continent. He died 3 years later, and King Richard had the body brought back to England. The king ordered the coffin opened. He kissed his friend's hand and looked at his face one last time, a moment showing his deep affection. The nobles had had enough of their king and conspired to depose him. He was captured by his cousin Henry, forced to abdicate, imprisoned and assassinated at the age of 32. James I. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless, her closest relative was James, the son of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had ordered beheaded. Mary had been imprisoned since James was 1 year old, so he didn't really remember her. After centuries of English kings trying to subdue Scotland, the two kingdoms were finally united under one monarch, James VI of Scotland, now becoming James I of England and Scotland. James's sexual preferences revealed themselves early on. At age 13, he became smitten with his 37-year-old cousin, Esme Stuart, whom he later made Duke of Lennox. One observer stated that James loved him so much that in front of everyone he often put his arms around his neck and kissed him. James had been King of Scotland since he was 1 year old. When he inherited the English throne at 36, he was used to Scottish law, where the king was above the law. In England, he was frustrated with the growing urban middle class who did not want an absolute monarchy. James also hated having to ask Parliament for permission to collect taxes, a power they rarely granted. A plot to remove King James involving the famous Sir Walter Raleigh was discovered. Raleigh was convicted of treason and beheaded. During James's reign, the English began colonizing what is now Canada and the United States. The Jamestown colony, Virginia, was named after him. Perhaps James's most lasting contribution was the printing of the King James Bible, one of the first translated into English. This translation had a profound influence on Protestant religion and remains very popular today. However, James still faced countless religious problems. The fuse that Henry VIII had lit when he founded the Protestant Church of England continued to burn. There was almost a huge explosion when a Catholic conspiracy group led by Guy Fawkes smuggled gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament to blow up King James and all the members of Parliament. The gunpowder plot was foiled, and this act of terrorism is still commemorated annually on November 5th. James had a warm relationship with his wife, Anne of Denmark, with whom he had 8 children. He also had affairs with other women, but that was expected of a king. It was his male lovers that caused controversy. He was openly bisexual and had several male lovers whom he appointed to powerful court positions, exceeding their capabilities. His lover, Robert Carr, was convicted of poisoning a court rival. James pardoned him, causing outrage. The king even built a secret passage connecting his bedroom with the bedroom of another lover, George Villiers, whom he made Duke of Buckingham and Lord High Admiral. Villiers was a poor leader, and Parliament tried to impeach him twice, but the king prevented it. After James died and Villiers no longer had royal protection, he was stabbed to death by a disgruntled army officer. While the king was alive, the rumour in London was that Elizabeth had been a king in the masculine sense, and now they had a queen in the feminine sense. The growing and extremely conservative Puritan sect did not approve of this. In fact, James was a hypocrite. He enforced harsh penalties for sodomy among his people. James died at age 58 after a 21-year reign. His tomb in Westminster Abbey is next to those of 2 of his lovers, George Villiers and Esme Stuart. William III. After a century of struggle for the throne between Protestants and Catholics, the Protestant majority had to accept the feared Catholic king, James II. Parliament did not accept this, so they invited 2 Protestants, William and Mary, to peacefully invade the country and depose James. William was the Prince of Orange and ruler of the Netherlands. His mother, Mary Stuart, was the daughter of King Charles I. His wife, Mary, was the daughter of the current King James II, and had a better claim to the throne, but she insisted her husband must be co-ruler. This suited William very well, as he was not someone who liked to stand behind his wife. Because they ruled at the invitation of Parliament, Parliament finally gained the right to decide. No standing army, no raising taxes, no making war without Parliament's permission, and Parliament decided who would be the monarch. This was called the Glorious Revolution because royal power was redefined without bloodshed. King James II tried to regain the throne from his daughter and son-in-law by raising a Catholic army in Ireland, but his forces were defeated at the Battle of the Boyne. William's victory there made him a hero to the Irish Protestants, who called him King Billy. The orange part of the Irish flag honours him. William cared more about his lands in the Netherlands and spent most of his time there, so Mary handled most of the ruling in England. 5 years after their co-reign began, Mary died of smallpox at age 32. William deeply mourned his wife. The couple had no children, and after Mary died, rumours of William's homosexuality began to circulate. He was said to have had affairs with 2 Dutch courtiers, Hans Wilhelm Bentinck and Arnold Joost van Keppel. He granted them lands and titles in England. Keppel, who was 20 years younger than the king, especially caused anger among the English nobility because he rose from page to earl at lightning speed. The next heir in line, Queen Mary's sister Anne, was not afraid that William would remarry and have an heir. She said that his heart was not for women, but was taken by a gentleman. Queen Anne. Like her sister, Anne married a Protestant, Prince George of Denmark. George was a lazy drunkard, and Anne had no interest in sharing power with him. She was the first married queen to rule in her own right. She loved the ceremonies and majesty of monarchy. In 1707, Parliament passed the Act of Union, finally making England and Scotland a single sovereign state called Great Britain. From this point on, all monarchs were called British instead of English. The combined flag of the two nations, known as the Union Jack, was widely used. Like some kings before her had male lovers, Anne had female lovers. The most important was Sarah Churchill, ancestor of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Sarah's husband was a top military commander, and Sarah's close relationship with the Queen made her the second most powerful woman in the country. Sarah was beautiful and charismatic, while Anne was plain, sickly and shy. Sarah often used her influence and was not afraid to disagree with the Queen. The two were political opposites. Sarah supported the progressive Whigs, while Queen Anne favoured the religious and conservative Tories. Anne grew increasingly tired of Sarah's political lectures and attempts to influence policy, especially prolonging the war on the continent led by Sarah's husband. Finally, Anne shifted her affections to another lady-in-waiting, Abigail Masham, who was young and gentle, completely the opposite of Sarah. Amidst this new relationship, Anne banished her first love from court. Queen Anne must have spent time with her husband because she had 17 pregnancies. Tragically, most resulted in miscarriages or stillbirths. Medical historians believe that many of Anne's pregnancy losses were due to her suffering from Hughes syndrome, which causes the blood to be sticky. This explains many of Anne's health problems, leading her to use a wheelchair later in life. Sticky blood has difficulty flowing through adult veins, but it's almost impossible to flow through the tiny veins of a fetus. A common medication today, aspirin, could have thinned Anne's blood and saved her children's lives. Anne's greatest hope, her son Prince William, died at the age of 11 from smallpox. With no clear heir to the throne after Anne, it was important for Parliament to decide who the next monarch would be. So they passed the Act of Settlement, which established the laws determining the line of succession in England to this day. The rules included: no Catholics would ever sit on the throne again. Only legitimate children were eligible. The monarch's spouse was not eligible, and male primogeniture, preference for the eldest son. Anne's nearest Protestant relative was Sophia of Hanover, who, despite being over 80 years old, was determined to outlive the sickly 49-year-old Anne to claim the throne. She almost succeeded, but a letter from Anne accusing her of plotting to seize the throne shocked her so much that she died 2 months before Anne. The throne finally went to Sophia's son, George, and a new German dynasty took center stage in England. It is tragic that these monarchs, like many other ordinary people, faced discrimination and violence simply for whom they loved. Their stories are testaments to the brutal prejudices of history. Hopefully, in a more civilized age, any future monarchs or members of the royal family who are part of the LGBTQ+ community will be accepted. Power, love, and the judgment of the era. Will there ever be a balance?